Thanks, Sally, for this nice introduction. Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Erik, Trouillet, responsible for governance, risk, and compliance at Xiting. Today, I have the honor to present you an important topic, and hopefully you find it as exciting as I do. So, compliance matters. I know it's actually not the favorite topic of many people, but in the end, it's a key aspect for every single organization in this world. Because in the end, it's all about regulations and so on. And in the end, it's not of the interest of any organization to receive a penalty or something like that. So basically, that it would cost money if a control would fail. And in the end, we are talking about risks that organizations are facing. So risks of any nature, but of course, as we're a cybersecurity provider, we will have a very strong technology focus today. So particularly talking about SAP, how you can achieve compliance by using principles and techniques in SAP. So very from a technical perspective. So of course, we have this session today to discuss how rule sets can become a value add for your organization. Of course, it's not a waste of time. We want to discuss that today in this session. All right, good. Next slide. So let's have a quick look at the agenda. So just a few words about Xiting. It's also that you get to know us a little bit better, and then already starting with the very important topic today. So importance of a rule set. And in this section, we will already answer at least partially the initial question that we have today. So is it a waste of time or rather not? So how can it become a value add for your organization? So emphasizing that one, because we have different perspectives on rule sets, and rule sets are not necessarily always about a certain, or it's not necessarily just talking about risks or managing risks in SAP. It can also become an enabler in terms of your processes. So to identify certain authorizations and users that are basically allowed to do some activity or to perform some actions in the system or not. Right. Third, we discussed rule sets in theory, so finding a good balance between effort and results. So basically, this is always the key question. So when we talk to our clients, then it's one of the first questions, or basically some as a sort of prerequisite, that they don't have to spend much time on building a rule set and implementing the rule set. So of course they give it rather in our hands. But then it also comes to operations. So how do I keep it up to date? So what are basically key principles that we can have a lean rule set, which can easily be kept up to date? So in terms of operations, that the client can manage the rule set himself. So that's always the big question and always the challenge that we are facing. So it's not just so much about training, because of course we could implement any type of rule set, but in the end it doesn't help if the client is not able to manage it, because then we will talk to the client in like 5 years time again to revisit or to revise the rule set and get it up to date. So we have a good example from one of our recent projects that we had in the past, so basically last year, where we had implemented rule set step by step, so basically process-wise. We will have a look at that later. And just to emphasize and to make it a bit more tangible for you, how we approach the rule set design and how we support our clients in implementing such a rule set and bringing it alive, right? All right, so objectives of today's session. So basically, first of all, answering the initial question, as I said, but also then having a good conversation about a simple approach to design this rule set. And there's no perfect rule set, not at all. There's no standard rule set that you can just easily implement. So you just head to the client, you implement it, it costs you a day since you just have a template available, and then you leave. That wouldn't be a good deal for the client. And in terms of a perfect rule set, so of course, as always, it depends on the organization, what is considered to be a good fit for the organization. So there are clients that are saying, okay, basically I'm good with just adding some business access, so basically some or a few authorization objects to the rule set, and then we are good to go. But there are other organizations, let's say, so basically we need to have the business with us, so they need to understand the rules since they are telling us what are the risks beyond. And having that said, then it always is a conversation about transactions, web infos, variants, and so on. So two different cases which have then in conclusion, then we have different rule sets as a sort of output from such an engagement, but the rule sets might be completely different. So always depending on the requirements and what the client wants to achieve. And then also, I mean, this is an important topic for all of us, the impact of SAP S/4HANA. So for some of you, or some of you might have went through this process already. So in terms of the implementation, but for some, it's still on the schedule or will be done in 2023, not this year, next year, doesn't matter. In the end, as you know, processes change with this or with SAP S/4HANA. So we also talk about other transactions and subsequently also about different objects. So not so much surprising for you, different authorizations being required in a process means also a different or an update to your rule set. So this needs to be incorporated as well. So a few words about Xiting itself. So we have been founded in 2008. So basically, originally from Switzerland. I'm also based in Switzerland, but we grew significantly over the years. So authorizations or subsecurity or cybersecurity in general sees a growing demand. So the whole practice is growing, and so basically we could spend every single minute on doing subsecurity engagements and talking about risks, authorization risks in SAP. So a little bit drowning in that, but since there is a huge demand, we grew to more than 100 people in the meantime. We are sub-certified, so even SAP is using our software, the XAMS, so which is basically originally a sort of, let's say, authorization management suite. This is what it is. But of course, since we are talking about risks caused by authorizations, inadequate authorizations, we would have some capabilities as a part of the XAMS, our solution. So in order to be able to address those findings and then doing the remediation of these risks. Right. So we have some reference clients. So basically, yes, since we started in Europe, many of those are from the German-speaking area. But of course, in the meantime, we grew also in the US and having some clients in the US already. All right, so let's jump into the second section and talking about the importance of a rule set. So let's reflect first what is considered a risk in SAP and how a rule set might be able to contribute to that. So in order to be able to manage the risk. So basically, so we are using here the DSAG, the German SAP user group guidelines, as a sort of good starting point for our conversation, to have a talk about what is actually sensitive in your system, because basically sensitive functions are those that are just or should only be assigned to a few individuals. Why that? Because apparently we are talking about some sensitive access that if it's used in a fraudulent way, it might harm the organization. So such fraudulent activities using sensitive access might cost a lot of money for the organization. And it's not just sensitive access as a single authorization. So when you have access to a certain transaction or to certain tables, it's also all about the segregation of duties. So in the end, so that, for example, we would not have people doing two functions, or that are not able to do two functions at the same time. That in the end could also result in a risk because of, let's say, personal interests of an individual. So what is actually considered critical, so, or a sensitive access? That's always the question that we talk about. And of course, it's quite hard, or it's a quite tough discussion, because the environments the clients are facing are completely, or might be completely different, depending on their, let's say, the country or the countries where they are operating, basically then the regulations that apply in those countries, and so on. So having that said, of course, first of all, it always starts with collecting the requirements. That's not something new. And we are also used to say, look, you also set, let's say, the minimum level in terms of what are the relevant requirements for your rule set. Since you have an internal control system, you have a certain risk appetite, you have your own risk profile. So we have to talk about what is really critical in your processes. And in the end, it's not just like, okay, we have certain regulations that you're facing. So in terms of data protection, also so from an operational point of view, things like that. Now it's also in terms of what are basically the crown jewels. This what is often called in the practice. What are your crown jewels in your organization that you want to protect? That could be simply access to certain recipes, things like that. So you might have a good interest in incorporating that one in a rule set in order to be able to see or to identify who has access to sensitive data or to carry out some sensitive functions in the system. So the rule set always needs to be aligned to the internal control system, because otherwise we are talking about a different set of risks, and in the end the control objectives of the internal control system are not met. So then it's not worth it to invest the time. So in that sense, in a rule set, so at least from a financial point of view, right? So the internal controls are designed to protect your organization from fraudulent activities from a financial point of view. So this is always a good starting point for your rule set. And then we are also talking about risks of another nature. So like from an operational point of view, things like that. So basically, how does a rule set contribute to your organization? So basically, first of all, it's risk management. So it's used in the risk management to control and mitigate your access risks. So whatever has been identified already as a part of your internal control system might rely on controls that are saying, okay, we need a segregation of duties or a segregation or a separation of access. So this is something that should be taken into consideration when designing a rule set. And from a risk perspective, then it might be a low risk, medium risk, high risk, whatever it is. In the end, of course, for a rule set, we also talk about the risk level. So what's the likelihood and the impact of a risk when you would have somebody exploiting the risk, right? So this has also an effect in terms of the processes, because in terms of risk management, particularly, it would mean, for example, just high risks are being addressed and other risks can be accepted. So this is always a very important topic, and in the end, you don't know what you end up with, because typically, initially you say, yeah, it's always some kind of high risk because it might have a financial impact. But in the end, the later you are in this project, the more the client tends to be a bit more, let's say, open to revisit the risk level, and then in terms of time, because then you don't have the time to remediate everything, and the risk levels are revised, sometimes at least. So that's interesting to see. Second, regulatory and internal requirements, I talked about it. So basically here we have the internal control system, SOX requirements. We have in Europe the data protection rules. And then, of course, also, for example, in pharma, we would have GXP, so GMP, GAMP requirements. So from an operational point of view, you need to be compliant. So in terms of computer systems validation, a few more risks that are a little bit wider or having another nature compared to what we typically see as a part of the internal control system. Third, we would have the project tools, technical support with the implementation of the new authorization concept. So basically, yes, a rule set could help you identifying risks in your roles and in terms of the users and their role assignments, because even before go live, of course, you can already identify who has critical or what type of critical access, and if you want to take action before it goes into production, and then the access might be used or even misused, right? So it's a good tool. Then, or a rule set can contribute significantly as a part of such authorization or role design projects. Also, we have one important topic, the awareness. When talking to the business, it's all about awareness, because basically we get the answer. So I'm okay with my department. So when talking to department heads, something like that, and they always insist, typically insist, they are okay with the access that the users have, that they trust them, and so on. But once you identify access, so which is basically used by other users, completely different users, then probably you would catch them and get their attention. So awareness, so in terms of using the rule set and running the risk analysis, you could actually make the business aware. It's not just their department having some critical access where it can be justified. So in terms of organization size and so on, there might be good reasons why somebody is having SOD conflicts in terms of authorizations in SAP. But what if somebody else completely different and unknown has the same access and might exploit it? Then you would have quickly another kind of conversation. And also it can be used as a controls instrument. So executing risk analysis regularly would help you achieving a controls objective that only, let's say, the right people have the right access. So doing that recurringly, then it's something that helps you to achieve or to make sure that you have effective controls in place. So also then having all the controls testing when talking to the auditors at the year-end, particularly when doing the year-end testing. All right. So what risks do we talk about? Of course, as I said, so environments might vary. So as a conclusion, there's no general recipe for all companies. So I can just arrive having my ruleset template in the back and hand it over and say, okay, just upload the files and you're good to go. Of course not. But however, of course, we would always talk about, let's say, the same standard risks in terms of purchasing, order to cash, things like that, where it's some sort of, or where we have some sort of common risks that basically all organizations have to deal with. So typically those are the risks that need to be addressed also from a SOX perspective, so things like that. So in the end, it's just the question about the rule set in general. Is it complete? So would you cover all relevant risks, or is there anything missed or left that you should be aware of? So from a project point of view, when we talk to our customers, it's always like, let's say, of course, it's in the beginning, it's some sort of template that we need as a baseline, that we use as a baseline for our discussions with the clients. But in the end, it will be tailored to the processes of the customer to make sure that only relevant risks are part of the rulebook. Because in the end, it's also an important topic, and we will discuss that later as well. It's all about the acceptance of the rule set. If the business does not see value add or a benefit of the rule set, it will not care much about it. And in the end, it's then again just IT running the risk analysis and then just trying to get some feedback if they need to take an action. And actually, it's the business who should take action. But in the end, there is some open finding, and nobody cares about it. Why that? Because there is no acceptance of the rule set. So it's a key element in such a project to have the business on board with you and to get the acceptance by them, that they really understand what the rule set is about and what it is for. So in the end, having a list of rules is something that helps, but it's not the general recipe and not enough to go live with that. So it really needs then adjustments, not just because of the list of risks being relevant. So you could go through the risk catalog and so on. So depending on the environment or industry that the customer is operating in, then in the end, it's also about the technology part. And so having custom developments and so on that should be taken into consideration for a rule set. So what are typical challenges today when using a rule set? So quite often we have clients with outdated rules. So as I said, so after 5 years, we will talk again to them if they are not able to manage the rule set. This is something that we don't want to see again and again. So of course, it's a starting point for our conversations as they have outdated rules because the processes and technology has changed. But in the end, of course, we want to enable them that they don't have rules that are outdated from time to time. Also, we would have, or we usually talk about incomplete rules. So incomplete rules that might also be caused by new technology, so implementing S/4HANA, and the same with imprecise rules. So basically, the rule set is designed the wrong way, or let's say the wrong authorization objects. So talking in a technical way now, you have the wrong authorization objects in the rule set, and you would not get the right results. So that's basically always the challenge. And we talked about acceptance. So in the end, of course, we want to have precise results. So we only get precise results when we don't have false positives or even false negatives. So then again, there's something incomplete. We would miss a good portion of the excess risk, and that should never happen. So in the end, to get precise results, we need precise rules, but always finding the right balance in terms of effort and results. So let's take an example. Well, we're going to SAP S/4HANA. We have SAP QM. There's a SAP node out there with a work list for the transition. And as you can see on the print screen on the right-hand side, we have a bunch of new authorization objects. So what if I don't add them to the rule set? We might have critical authorizations, and we have then later a good example what it looked like in the practice. So as we did such a project with one customer, and particularly in QM, if you don't have the right QM objects in the rule set, you would miss actually the critical access, so all the access risks in the QM area, because you're simply looking at something different and not what you should actually look for. So the critical access might now relate to other objects as you were looking, or compared to what you were looking to or at in the past. So as you can see in this table, there are some, or a good portion of new authorization objects, and replacing other old, outdated authorization objects. So this is a very good example of when you need to take action when doing an upgrade. So let's head into the third section, rule sets in theory. And now it's all about the question, what is actually considered to be a good balance between the effort and the results? So as I said, it's all about the acceptance by the business, because the business has nominates process owners. They are responsible for the processes, so they need to give the input and they need to be aware of the risks. Not necessarily so much on the technical layer, because they might have, let's say, support from the IT side, module consultants with good technical expertise in a certain sub-module, for example, but also from the business itself, key users. Right, so in the end, it always requires a good input from the business, and of course, they don't want to start from scratch. So as I said, when we would have such an engagement or such a project at a client, then we would come with a risk catalog, so much longer than what you would see in the XAMS today, much more complex, and then we basically do risk workshops to identify what are the processes And so basically the risks in scope. So what are the risks that we need to look at? So basically doing a selection of relevant risks based on a standard catalog, and then enhancing those risks by, let's say, industry specific or customer specific risks that might deal with GXP and so on. So when we are receiving a request for creating a rule set, then it should always be quick, easy, and with little complexity. How we can achieve that, we talk about that in a minute. It's always driven by compliance requirements, as I said, but also typically caused by audit findings. So we had several implementations of rule sets where we were addressing audit findings related to the existence of a rule set. So there was not even any rule around to identify SOD conflicts based on access granted in the system. So those are key elements or key drivers for implementing a new rule set. Then in terms of maintenance, there's a high demand or large demand for a single rule set for all systems. So basically having a sort of repository and then apply those rules to any type of system, and also not so much worrying or caring about the release level. And then also very important, incorporating transactions, web intros, and Fiori apps, which is basically the language that the business understands. And we would be able, so from an authorization point of view, of course, we are able to understand authorization objects, but the business usually doesn't understand this sort of language. So our role in such projects is typically translating the business language into the technical language. Yeah, so probably, so in terms of time, we can keep that short. In terms of acceptance, I just want to add that also, so in terms of or in relation of the or in relation to the results, it needs to be in a sort of understandable and readable format. This is what typically GRC tools struggle with, that the results are still very technical. So of course, we need to be able to make it a bit clearer and understandable for the business to see or to understand what is actually the risk that we are talking about and for what user. We have solved that in a quite simple way for this example project that I'm going to present in a few minutes, just using Excel, but to keep it as simple as possible and not flooding the business with too technical information that they actually don't care about. In terms of creating the rule set, so as I said, initially we do the requirements analysis. We come along with a template rule set, and we would enhance it by custom developments, for example. But in the end, and when it comes to the creation of the rule set, then it's about the strategy, what should be taken into consideration. So from a technical point of view, how complex should the rule set itself look like? And this is about the maintenance strategy, so, or let's say the rule definition strategy. So basically, we'll come to that in a minute on the next 2 slides, then to clarify what I mean by that. And once we have created the rule set and have run or executed the risk analysis, first on role level and second on user level, then we start with the remediation, and if we are done with the remediation, then it's all about the mitigation of risks. So basically applying controls to make sure that the risk level can be reduced to low or something like that, so that it is, let's say, that it is acceptable for process owners, for example. So key elements when performing a risk analysis. So we have typically the business access component. So the access that can be used within a transaction. But also an important element is the application access. So this is when you talk to the business departments and they want to see clear results, and they probably want to reperform some actions in the queue system to see, is that really a tangible, a real, genuine SOD conflict. So executing that in the queue system might be an option, but always our customers struggled a bit with, let's say, the false positives that they had when they were already using a rule set and executed a risk analysis regularly. Because false positives means somebody might have the access to the transaction but can't do anything within the transaction. So we were thinking about it, how can we have, let's say, a lean rule set, but with effective results. So that makes sense, and that the business department would basically understand and could execute or test it in the queue system, and then they would see they face a real SOD conflict. So this was something where we thought about it quite a while, and we believe it doesn't make sense to have very precise rules for any type of situation, because you have providers with rule set databases, so basically again templates, but being very, very granular and very specific. But then you would always end up with the question how to maintain it, by having a subscription to some kind of SAP S model, so that you receive updated rules, or how do you manage your rule set. In the end, we concluded it only makes sense to have all the required or all the relevant transactions and all the, let's say, other application objects in the rule set in combination with the business access. So basically the business access reflected by certain authorization objects that are basically the common denominator of all the transactions within such a rule. So that way we could keep the rule very simple. It's still understandable, so for an authorization administrator from a technical point of view, but also having the application component as a part of the rule, we make it tangible or visible to the business what this rule is actually about. And we put it one example at the bottom, so to create and release a purchase order, because basically such a rule doesn't need to be very, very complex. And these are just examples. So we are, in the end, we are talking about a bunch more transactions, of course, but we just wanted to demonstrate it's not like we require a rule set where we talk about 10 different ways how you can create a purchase order. In fact, yes, 10 different transactions might exist, but the objects being used to test the user's authorizations in terms of business access, those are always the same. And those are the ones that are listed here. So basically for creating a purchase order, we always talk about the document type authorizations, the purchasing group authorizations, and so on. So basically the key authorization objects that should be incorporated into the rule. And for releasing a purchase order, it's even simpler, because in the end, it's just a single object. Of course, you would require a bunch more objects, but what's the likelihood? Are those the very critical objects, or probably those uncritical objects are also part of other roles? So we really need to look at the very important objects, and this is the way how we basically built the rule set. And this way, we would not need to invest a lot of time in terms of creating or building new rules, but also from an operational point of view, it can be easily maintained. And afterwards, it's again about the risk treatment. So first, starting with the remediation on the role level, because it will have an exponential effect also on the user level. So remediating probably all the findings if you can on role level, and then looking at the user level. And the real risk is only on the user level itself, because this is when users are able to make use of these authorizations. So it doesn't harm my system to have a critical access in a role as long as it's not assigned to anybody. But if it gets assigned to somebody, then it becomes visible and probably a real risk for me. And once we get clean, of course, it's always the challenge to stay clean, and then running a recurring risk analysis like every month or every quarter to make sure, and also as a part of your provisioning processes, so like sort of preventive control to make sure that you don't introduce new SLE conflicts, neither on role level nor on user level. And if you would introduce them, that you are made aware and that you address them and mitigate them if required. Yeah, in terms of time, so basically we covered that already. Again, I want to point out, so key principle, having precise results. So precise results means always first looking at the business access, but also talking about the application access, then doing the remediation, and only finally doing the mitigation, because the mitigation is again business responsibility, and it's very unlikely that the IT department would be able to do the assignment of mitigating controls. In the end, business is responsible for their processes, and it should never end up with the IT department. In terms of, so maybe worth to add here, in terms of complexity, it's also having an effect on the performance. So we had one customer where the risk analysis was running more than 20 hours. So this is, of course, not an ideal scenario and should be avoided whenever you can. So this would be the effect if you have too complex rules and if you don't care about findings on role level, because that's what I'm talking about was a situation that was on user level, so basically bad results on user level. But why that? It was basically caused by many findings on the role level. So just to emphasize, doing the remediation on the role level first is key for the success of such a project, and then doing the remediation on the user level. And remediation is not something that you can do within hours. That's typically a project, a separate project, once you build the rule set. All right, so we don't have much time left, so let me talk about an example from one of our clients from last year. So we are talking about a pharma client, so facing GXP requirements, and they had already a role concept in place with well-established business roles. What was a bit kind of challenge is the type of role concept that they were using. So basically they had the enabler concept in place. For those who are not familiar with that, that basically means you decouple the access, that you decouple the functional access from the organizational access. So you would make sure that all the organizational access is set inactive or invalidated in the functional roles. And then you just grant the access through additional roles. And this is, let's say, in contrast to the master-derived philosophy or where you usually have the master role, and in the derived role you would bring in all the organizational access on top of it. This particular client was already using the exams tools, so in terms of doing the risk analysis or carrying out the risk analysis and doing mask changes and so on, they were already in a good position. But however, they were never using any type of rule set. But they knew already from certain situations from the past, there are SOD conflicts around. The organization is not that big. They grew quite a lot in the past, let's say 2-3 years. However, it never became visible where they have real SOD conflicts and inadequate critical access granted to business users. So all in all, it was the objective to implement a rule set, and that's step by step, so process-wise, with subsequent remediation and mitigation of findings. So they were using the XAMS and to carry out the risk analysis when doing the role changes. So they had also implemented a new module, which was very important from a GXP point of view because it was about plant maintenance. So new roles were created and they wanted to check those roles. So they were using the XAMS tools to do the scan before all the roles got effectively created in PFCG and then allocated to business roles and finally assigned to users. And we ended up then, after doing some quality assurance and some additional reporting, we ended up with the users then in the production system. And yeah, we already knew that some role assignments are causing an SOD conflict, but in the end, we could address them up front before the go live was taking place. All right, so what did we end up with? Basically, 9 sensitive access risks for plant maintenance, so clear GXP focus. Then we had agreed that it would make sense to continue with the customer service, 9 SODs, and finally finance, and more to come in the next few months, which is not yet clear. But however, we kept extending or enhancing a rule book and adding new risks step by step. But we were always in a sort of good position that we were focusing on a clear process. So we only had to talk to one module consultant and to 2-3 users, key users from the business, and one process owner. So the focus helped quite a lot that we could get through this process to define the relevant access risks quite quickly. And also in terms of testing and then allocating some or planning some time for doing the risk analysis and some remediation, it was helpful that it was just the focus on one particular module. So in the end, yes, just as I said, it's not rocket science. So the documentation of the rulebook needs to take place anywhere. The client is not, or was not having, it was not a big organization, so they didn't have an ICS tool where they could basically document all those risks, and so basically the rule definitions. So in the end, we had created a separate Excel document as the baseline for the rule set being implemented then in the system. There were a few more tabs then with the, in the end, a listing of the whole authorization objects being used as a part of a rule. So basically, of course, you need to make sure this is in line with what you have in the system. So whenever you change something, it should be reflected in the documentation. So, but that's not something new. And in terms of the format, how you present it to the business, we try to keep it as simple as possible. So having all the risks at the top, and then left-hand side, all the business roles, basically with the corresponding description to make it a bit better visible for the business to understand what is it actually about. So what are we talking about in terms of risks in a certain role? And we had the same exercise then on user level. And there you can basically see, even though the roles looked quite good, it didn't look that good on user level because many access risks were caused by the combination with an organizational role. Because you don't have just the organizational values in such an enabler or organizational role. It's all about the other fields that would come with those affected objects along. And those were causing a few more access risks that we needed to talk about with the business. So long story short, since we are also running a bit out of time, yeah, the risk analysis was worth it. So since we identified a lot of findings and the assumptions of the client were proven to be correct, so it was like a confirmation and it made sense to have this sort of project. So it was good evidence, and now this was the reason why they kept it going and we continued this project. And now proceeding with the next process area. We had a lot of, even on role level, a lot of FI related inadequate authorizations. So it's not just about access given by the single role, but also combination and business roles. And then finally, on user level, as I said, the enabler concept gave us some headache because that was giving us only that one was giving us the full picture of what's the current status of the role concept looks like. And then in the end, we also had the discussions or conversations about display roles, since they were using it quite a lot. The display roles weren't always necessarily also just display roles, because we had some sort of cross-pollination, again, caused by the enabler roles. And then the risk analysis helped us to reshape those enabler roles, yeah, to make sure that we get rid of some cross-pollination of access. All right, so yeah, in terms of deliverables, I keep it short. Key message of that: so when doing such a project, it's not just implementation of the rule set, so not just about the upload files, so the rule set itself. A lot more deliverables came into play. Since it was a GXP environment, we also had to write test plans, perform the testing, document the testing, and so on, and also having effects on the currently established authorization management document and some other guidelines. And last but not least, the risk analysis reports itself for some recommended actions, so action plans. And the S4 implementation is still ahead of them. So we had created a good baseline to start with. But again, as I said, so there are some process changes that will be introduced with S4HANA, and you can't avoid them. So in terms of time, there was some certain pressure why they already had to start with creating a rule set. Ideally, you would do that as a part of the S4 implementation, but in the end, it would have been too late. So we already covered, so let's say 80% of the rule set. So where possible. All right, still a little bit on time. We have a few minutes left, so thanks for listening, and yeah, opening the round for questions.
So we did one question in here that is pretty lengthy. So I think we're going to add it into the email that will go out with the link to the video. Okay.
Okay.
And the other two that you had given me, because we are short on time. Thank you, Eric. Remember that there will be 2 more sessions through March 16th. And again, the link to the registration is in the chat or the handout section of the GoTo screen, sorry. You do need to register for each session separately to receive the link to the session and the recording link after the session has completed. If you do not receive an email or have any other questions regarding today's session, please reach out to marketing@xiting.com or myself at sjames@xiting.com. Let us know and we'll send it out again. Have a great rest of your day and hope to see you guys again next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.